Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Unstressed Exec, where we talk about how to perform, lead, and live with clarity, calm, and confidence, even when life feels like it's coming apart at the seams. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach, and someone who has spent decades working with individuals and systems where conflict is not just present, but constant. Before we dive in, a quick reminder. If these conversations resonate with you and you want practical tools to apply what you're learning, check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a no BS, clinically grounded guide designed to help you spot manipulation early, regulate your responses, understand high conflict personalities, and protect your clarity in high conflict situations. Today's episode is about a type of person who leaves everyone around them exhausted, confused, and asking the same questions again and again. Why does everything with them turn into a fight? This episode is titled High Conflict Personalities, the Internal Logic of Chaos. And if you've ever dealt with someone who seems to create conflict, escalate situations unnecessarily, or thrive on drama no matter how reasonable you try to be, this episode will give you clarity you didn't know you were missing. I'm going to start with basically defining what a high conflict personality really is. Let's start with an important distinction. High conflict people are not just difficult. They're not just emotional, and they're not just bad communicators. High conflict personalities have a fundamentally different relationship with conflict itself. They don't resolve conflict. They regulate themselves through it. They need it in a way to help them feel some degree of homeostasis. Conflict is not a problem for them. Conflict is actually the solution. That's the part most people miss. And when you understand that it's their default mechanism, it's an arena in which they feel most comfortable, then you could begin to understand how to proceed forward. And one of those implications is why logic and calm never work. One of the most common experiences people report is this: the calmer I get, the worse they become. And that's not accidental. For high conflict personalities, calm feels unsafe. Resolution feels like a threat. Stability feels like a loss of control. Chaos, on the other hand, that's what they're used to. That's their default mechanism. It feels familiar. It feels regulating to them. It gives them energy, identity, and a sense of purpose. And to some degree, it brings attention back to them. So when you try to de-escalate or explain, compromise, resolve, they unconsciously experience that is actually destabilizing. And they want to get back to a level of conflict where they feel familiar. So they respond by escalating. And there's an internal logic to this chaos. And here's the internal script operating beneath the surface. And it's important to understand this so you can uncrack the code and figure out how to best deal with these people. So some of the phrases that they may say to themselves are things like this: if there's conflict, I'm activated. If I'm activated, I feel real. I feel seen. If I feel real, I then feel powerful. And if I feel powerful, then I am safe. And that's the loop that they tend to play inside their head. Of course, the words may be different. There might be some different emotional complexes tied to it, but that's basically the activating loop that becomes their default mechanism. Conflict is not about the issue. It's about maintaining their own emotional equilibrium, or what I said earlier, their own emotional homeostasis. And it's neuroscientific at that point. And this is why the conflict never seems proportional to the situation. They are not trying to calibrate the level of dysregulation or conflict to what the situation calls for, because it's not about the situation. It's about internally what they need to feel that equilibrium and get back to homeostasis. That's because the situation is relevant. And you might be wondering as you reflect, I want you to for a moment, reflect on the people in your life that so far fit this mold. And one of the things that might be coming, and probably at some point should be coming to your awareness, is why everything becomes a crisis. High conflict personalities tend to blow minor issues out of proportion. They reinterpret neutral events as attacks. They assume malicious intent where none was existing. And they create enemies when there aren't any. There's a great quote by Brene Brown that says, if you look in the world for confirmation that you don't belong, you will find it. And the flip applies as well. If you look to the world for confirmation that you are important and you do belong, you will find it. Well, the high conflict personality is looking at the world for conflict. They're going to find it. And if they don't find it, they're going to manufacture it. They often operate with an internal belief that the world is hostile, unfair, or out to get them. There's another great meme, and I know I mentioned it on other episodes. It's a meme of a therapist asking her patient, well, didn't you see the red flags? And the patient responds with, well, yes, but I thought it was a carnival. And I love that because it's so true. How we see the world, the colored glasses that we have on reflect the world. And it can reflect it by having us see things that aren't there. It could also reflect it by not seeing things that are there. For example, if you put on rose-colored glasses, red flags don't look like red flags. They just look like flags because the rose-colored glasses block out the redness of the actual flag, right? So again, high conflict people see the world as unfair to them, always looking for hostile interaction, or even bordering on paranoia out to get them. So every interaction becomes a potential threat, and every threat has to be dealt with, has to be confronted, and loudly. So I'm going to review some common high conflict personality profiles. And yes, these do dovetail with actual psychological personality disorders that are outlined in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's kind of like the Bible of mental health disorders in the psychiatric and mental health communities. So high conflict behavior cuts across multiple personality styles. It's important to be aware of that. So let's talk about what those common ones are. The first is the narcissistic high conflict personalities. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about a formal narcissistic personality disorder. There's gray areas here. One can have narcissistic traits and not meet full criteria for narcissistic personality disorders. I also talked several episodes ago about the influence market, especially on social media, and how the term of narcissistic personality or narcissism has been weaponized. And I think way overextended. That said, I want to be clear here that across these personality profiles, I'm really talking about different traits or tendencies. I'm not getting into a formal clinical discussion of formal personalities. Okay, disclaimer done. Narcissistic high conflict personalities. These individuals experience disagreement as humiliation or shame. So if you challenge them, correct them, or fail to affirm them, they will escalate. They will feel like their sense of self is being attacked or shamed, or in some cases, even feeling annihilated. So they have to reassert equilibrium, homeostasis, by creating conflict and trying to control so that you can then restore their sense of ego. Conflict restores their sense of superiority as well. They don't want resolution. They want validation. They want strokes of their ego. That's your narcissist, or those with narcissistic traits, to be more precise. The next is your borderline style high conflict personalities. And yes, this term borderline does come from borderline personality disorder. The quintessential model for borderline personality disorder is the character that was played by Glenn Close in the movie Fatal Attraction. That's a bit dated for younger folks listening, but it's a great movie. And she does a really good job of capturing the hot, cold, I love you, I hate you, kind of flipping, emotional flipping that somebody with borderline traits will tend to do. So these individuals experience conflict as abandonment. Emotional intensity helps them feel connected. So some of us have been in relationships in our past, especially when we were younger, where it felt like every time there was conflict, the person overreacted. They reacted in dramatic ways, trying to pull us back to them. And the intensity of it, not only in that dynamic, but our intensity of reacting makes them feel connected and loved. In extreme examples, and I imagine some of you have experienced this, unfortunately, the person might make claims of wanting to hurt themselves or wanting to kill themselves. And that's another example that we can see sometimes in the borderline makeup, where it's this sense of you're threatening to leave me, or I'm getting signs that you're leaving me, or I'm interpreting signs as such, meaning you just didn't text me one night. You didn't include me. You didn't invite me to something that I thought you should have. I experienced it as abandonment. I have to reestablish emotional intensity because when things are intense, I feel loved. They equate love with intensity. So I then need to escalate the situation to force an intense response from you. Now I feel connected again. Now things can calm down. The next time that happens, where I feel like you're not giving me the intensity that I need, I escalate again. And then the pattern repeats. Calm for these people feels like distance. And distance is no good. It's no bueno, right? So they provide conflict to restore that emotional closeness. It's not true emotional closeness at any healthy level because it's born out of a conflict dynamic. Next, we have the paranoid high conflict personality. These individuals interpret ambiguity as threat. So paranoia also loves a vacuum. So when there's mixed signals, unclear signals, ambiguous signals, they perceive that as they're leaving me. They're breaking up with me. They never loved me. And they jump to very hypervigilant and even paranoid levels of thought process with this. They're constantly scanning for betrayal. What's on your phone? Who are you looking at? Who did you call last night? You stepped outside for 5 minutes and talked to somebody. Who was it? You said you talked to your sister. I don't trust you. Let me see your phone. This is the paranoid kind of. Now, you could also get some overlap with these other personality styles, but I'm trying to give you kind of a clean version of the paranoid style. Conflict allows them to confirm their worldview. If we're fighting, then I was right not to trust you. So they create conflict. They view the relationship in a very hypervigilant, even paranoid manner of I can't trust you. They create conflict. And then when you react in a fairly understandable way to the conflict, they say, oh, I got you. There you go. There's the sign that I can't trust you. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then you have the chronic victim or the victim mentality, high conflict personality. These individuals organize their identity around being wronged or victimized. We've all seen this. Hopefully, most of us, but I imagine some of us have been in relationships like this. Conflict reinforces their narrative of I'm the victim. But by being the victim, what they get out of it is they get attention and they might get sympathy. And that strokes the victimhood. It reinforces it. These people don't want solutions. They want recognition of their suffering, of their victimhood. They want to stay the victim. And they also don't want to take accountability. So again, we walked through narcissistic, borderline, paranoid, and chronic victim mindset. So when you're engaging with these types of high conflict personalities, why is it that you feel like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Well, when you're dealing with a high conflict person, you will often feel hypervigilant, always anxious before having interactions. And it may not be every interaction, but it's the interactions where, I know they're going to bring something up, last night, I'll give you an example. This didn't really happen. I'm just giving you an example. So you go out with your girlfriend and last night you both had drinks and you got drunk and you came home and you passed out. You didn't talk, you didn't sit up, you didn't have any intimacy, and you just went to bed and you crashed out. And then you wake up before they do and oh man, an argument's with me. You didn't talk to me. You went straight to bed. Why do you care more about drinking than me? Are you seeing somebody else? Who are you dating? Who are you flirting with at the party? So you have anxiety before the interaction even occurs. You feel responsible for their emotions, or you're just exhausted after conversations. It's just draining. That's because you're being pulled into their regulation system. This is such a key thing to be mindful of and be aware of. They have a need to regulate their own nervous system based on the categories I just discussed, and they're pulling you in as a tool to regulate that. That's why you're exhausted. That's why you feel responsible. That's why you feel anxious. You're being recruited to stabilize their internal chaos. And the moment you stop doing that, what happens? They escalate. That's their way of pulling you back in as their regulating tool. Okay. And here's why you can't fix them. And it's the hardest truth. You cannot reason someone out of a pattern that emotionally stabilizes them. I know it sounds kind of fucked up, and it is in a way, but this is their pattern of stabilizing themselves. It's maladaptive. It's not healthy, but it's their pattern. So until they replace it with something healthy, it's ride or die for them. It's life and death for them. So you cannot reason them out of that pattern. Insight feels threatening to high conflict personalities. Accountability feels like annihilation. Resolution feels like something's been lost. So even when they seem to understand, even when they apologize, even when they promise change, the pattern returns. Their words and their actions are not aligned because the actions are actually giving them some degree of feeling stabilized, even though it's unhealthy. And that's because the conflict serves a purpose. Let me give you a case example of this. It's what I call the never-ending workplace drama. I worked with a leader who had one employee who consumed 80% of their time. Now, this leader had about 10 people under him, but 80% of the time was consumed by this one employee. There was drama, there was conflict. At the smallest request was met with victimhood and complaints and why me and why is no one else getting this and so on. Every week there was a new crisis. It was a misunderstanding or perceived slight, an emotional explosion. The leader kept trying to resolve it, coaching them, clarifying expectations, mediating conversations. Nothing worked. Why? Why? Because resolution removed the employee's primary source of emotional regulation. And that's much deeper than the logic of just working out a problem. Once the leader stopped engaging emotionally and shifted to structured, neutral, written communication, the chaos diminished. Not because the employee healed, but because the fuel source was gone. You no longer had a hook. The person no longer could pull the leader into the never-ending abyss of complaints. That solved it. Now, in this particular case, that employee continued to cycle because the employee wasn't willing to do the work and eventually was performance managed out of the organization, which needed to happen at that point. Whether they went on to do the internal work they needed to do to grow, I have no idea. But from a leader perspective, the leader was able to navigate it. So what's the biggest mistake that people make with high conflict personalities? Well, the biggest mistake is assuming that the conflict is about the content, that it's about arguing the merits of whatever the issue is, but it's not. Underneath that is the real issue. It's about control. And it's critical that you're aware of that if you're engaging in high conflict personalities, because you will never win on the content. You will never win on the sake of the argument. It's what is going on below the surface. If this was a video podcast, and eventually I intend to go to video and start interviewing people, I often do this. I point from my head to your head, and I say, this is the surface content level of the argument. But there are times when what's really happening at the deeper level, the more profound level, the more impactful level, it's heart to heart or solar plexus to solar plexus. That is where the actual emotional interaction is occurring. And with high conflict personalities, you might be staying at the content level, but you have to be aware of what's going on under the surface emotionally. And the moment you treat it like a problem to solve instead of a pattern to manage, you get trapped. So the goal is you have to treat it like a pattern, an emotional pattern to manage. That's that solar plexus to solar plexus, if you need an image for that. So how do you manage these personalities? Well, managing high conflict personalities requires a shift in mindset. And it's the one I just teased you with, but I'm going to go into specifics with specific techniques to do so. You are not there to resolve. You are there to contain. And here's how to do it. Be brief. Short responses, no storytelling, no emotional processing. The longer you talk, the more material they have. Now, if you're listening regularly, you'll notice that last week when I talked about handling the manipulative personality, I also used this technique. It's very effective for gaslighters, manipulators, and high conflict personalities because they have overlaps. So number one, be brief. Number two, be informative, not emotional. Stick to the facts, dates, deadlines, decisions. Emotion fuels escalation. Now, you might be wondering, George, you just said you can't really win this at a content level. I stand by that. But when you're engaging in the interaction, if you go into the emotional interaction, if you try playing or like fencing with them emotionally, you're going to lose. They've been doing this for years. This is how they get their basic needs met. They're going to be better at it than you are. You have to be cognizant of what's going on emotionally, but you don't want to be over emotional and pulled into emotional dialogue. So keep to the facts, stay informative. Third, be friendly, but neutral. Another way I like to say this is all too often in the corporate space, leaders want to be nice. Nice is the worst thing you can be. Instead, you want to be kind, but not nice. Kind is I'm going to treat you with respect. I'm going to treat you with dignity. I'm going to treat you with integrity and honesty. But it doesn't mean I'm going to be nice. I can give very harsh feedback to you about what you need to change, how you need to grow, and do it in a kind, respectful way without necessarily being nice. Nice means I don't want to hurt your feelings. Kind means I respect you as who you are, and I respect where you can grow and develop into, and I'm going to give you the feedback that you need to get there. That's the difference. So being kind, not nice, is very similar to being friendly, but neutral. Be polite, be calm, be professional. You want to have warmth without intimacy. We're not friends. We're not best friends. We're not buddies, but I respect you greatly as a person and a human and a professional. So that's the third. Fourth, be firm. State boundaries once and then stand by them. Repeat them calmly if you must. Don't justify, don't debate. Again, especially with certain high conflict victims like the chronic victim style, you don't want to get into a huge ongoing debate about your boundaries and why they're either right or wrong or good or bad. It's never ending, especially that victim category. It's a never ending abyss of yes, buts, yes, but. Next, reduce engagement. This is the fifth, reduce engagement. You don't need to attend every argument you're invited to. I love that. Every time someone tries to bait you into an argument, you don't have to show up. You could deflect. You could walk away. You could say, we're not having this conversation right now. Silence is sometimes the most powerful response, especially if it comes through a text or an email. You don't need to engage on that part of it. And lastly, document everything. If you're in the corporate space, the business space, the workspace, high conflict personalities often try to rewrite history. What you did, what you said, what you didn't do, what you didn't say. Document your interactions. Documentation protects the reality, and it protects you downstream if you have to justify or back up what you did or what you said or what you didn't do or didn't say. So what happens when you stop feeding the chaos? Well, when you stop engaging emotionally, one of two things are going to occur. And again, if you're listening, this is the same thing with manipulative personalities. I reviewed it last week. One, either the person de-escalates because the pattern no longer works. Think of their escalation of conflict in the high conflict personality as a fire. When you take oxygen out of the room, what happens to a fire? It doesn't have anything to feed on. So the pattern no longer works. So either it de-escalates or they can escalate temporarily because now the pattern's threatened and they're experiencing what in the behavioral sciences we call an extinction burst. An extinction burst is if you give a rat, this goes way back to the work of Bandura and Skinner and behaviorists. If you give a rat a pellet and you have it hit a lever to get a pellet of food, and it hits the lever, it gets a pellet, hits the lever, gets a pellet, hits the lever, gets a pellet. And at some point you suddenly stop giving the pellet of food. You would think, well, the rat's simply going to stop right away. No, the rat is going to aggressively escalate hitting the lever because it thinks it has to hit it more. It desperately wants the pellet of food. So it's going to hit that lever in order to get the food. In the same way, when you stop feeding the chaos and the conflict, think of it as a fire, you stop feeding it, you stop giving it oxygen, it will temporarily escalate. It will temporarily get worse. And all too often, the untrained or unknown leader is going to think, oh, things are getting worse. They're not. You're getting an extinction burst. And if you stick with your boundaries and continue to not engage and de-escalate, don't give it oxygen, it will filter away. That escalation is not failure. It's confirmation that you are doing the right thing. Okay, let me give you some closing reflections as we tie up here. High conflict personalities are not chaotic by accident. Chaos is functional for these people. It's their default mechanism. And once you understand that, you stop trying to change them and you start changing how much access they have to you. Again, to stick with our metaphor from earlier, you are changing the amount of oxygen. You need boundaries. That's what you need. All right, let me close up here with a call to action. If today's episode resonated and you're ready to strengthen your ability to manage high conflict dynamics without losing yourself, I strongly invite you to check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity, specifically Chapter 11. I devote an entire chapter to these personalities, how to be aware of them, how to manage them. The workbook is a practical, no BS guide to navigating difficult people, regulating your nervous system, and responding with clarity instead of chaos. It's available now on Amazon, and I will drop a link in the show notes. And remember, insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn stress into strategy and conflict into clarity, coaching can help accelerate that shift. Coaching will change you. You can find me at www.theunstressedexec.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias. Thank you for listening. And remember, shift happens.